Hello, and welcome to the latest episode of The Invisible Men. My name is Ian Rowe. I'm a senior fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and also the founder of Vertex Partnership Academies, an international baccalaureate public charter high school in the Bronx. My partner in crime, Nike Fajors, unfortunately will not be joining me on this episode, so it's going to be mano a mano. And very excited, though, that my counterpart on this show will be the inimitable Clifton Duncan. Hello, Clifton. How are you?
Mr. Rowe, it's a pleasure to meet you. I've been described as a lot of things, but inimitable is one of the rarer things that labels that
Oh
have been used
no, no.
about me.
Oh no, absolutely. There's a great line in Hamilton actually where he uses the word inimitable. In a way that I know you come to mind as a great actor, and as a way to introduce you to our audience. You are classically trained actor, writer, singer. You're a playwright, and we'll get into that because you are working on a one-man show focused on Thomas Sowell, and you might know that at this very moment there are tens of thousands of people across the country who are advocating that Dr. Thomas Sowell receive the Presidential Medal of Freedom. So we'll get into that. But welcome to the show. Really good to see you.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Ian.
Yeah. So, we usually like to begin our discussions before you became the Clifton Duncan, who has such a great following and, accomplished what you have. Tell us a little bit about your growing up, because you were born overseas, and also particularly, when did you realize that race was a thing, that people somehow, like your skin color had kind of meaning, other than, and it meant something other than, your eye color?
Right. Yeah. So I had I think a very unusual upbringing. My mother was in the army, and so she. So I was born in Heidelberg, Germany, and we spent when people ask me where I'm from, I say Germany, Virginia, Belgium, and Virginia in that order. So for the first 4 years of my life, we lived in Heidelberg, and I don't sprechen Deutsch, unfortunately, not yet.
You
Anyway,
don't speak German.
no, not yet. It's on my list of languages, though, I think. But then we moved to Hampton Roads, Virginia, or the Tidewater area, for anybody familiar with that, with southeastern Virginia.
Yeah.
And then we moved to Belgium from ages 8 to 12. Then we came back to the same area in Virginia. So I'm sort of unique in that I had a very, a broad experience. When I was, especially that time in Belgium, I had friends from Turkey, from Greece, from the Netherlands, from Flanders, from Denmark, as well as my American friends. And so, when I was a kid and, we're playing basketball during recess or going over to my friend's house to play, video games, Super Nintendo was really hot at the time.
Yeah.
It was never a thing. My barber was this ginger-headed, freckled Frenchman. And, it was never a thing. I never felt either from the American kids or from my teachers or from any of the Europeans that I met, or foreigners that I met. I guess they weren't foreigners over there, but you know what I mean.
Yeah.
There was never any sort of animus there. I never felt as if I was being treated differently. I was just a kid, and in a very privileged sort of way, I was able to experience many different kinds of people. And then when I came back, it was huge. It's funny now you asked me this question. I didn't even think I'd go into all this, but I think part of the racial awakening, I think, from a specifically American lens, occurred when I got back from Belgium, and I was 12 years old, and it was a massive, massive culture shock. Hip hop was pretty big. I didn't discover hip hop until about 2 years later. As Biggie Smalls, like, oh my God, they're cursing. It was pretty intense, but I was pretty much a weirdo. But even then, it wasn't quite a thing about blackness. But I would say that it really, really, thinking back on it, when I was in eighth grade, I had a quote unquote girlfriend. Her name was Linda, I believe. And, she was a cute little thing. And, it was as much of a girlfriend as you could have in eighth grade. And I remember one of my classmates, a little boy named, I think it was Samuel, who, he's like, man, why are you with that girl? I was like, I don't know, we like each other. And he just goes, yeah, but she's white.
Oof.
And, we're 12, 13 years old at the time. You know what I mean? And it literally meant nothing to me. I had a crush when I was 10 or 11 on this girl named Melissa, who looked like Heather Locklear. It never really, it never really occurred to me or mattered to me to see things. But I do remember one of the big sort of aha moments, or maybe, what can I say? Eye-opening moments was, there were so many kids that that I remembered, but they didn't remember me when I returned. And I remember specifically this kid named Ronald. And when I left, I think I left about third or fourth grade, and he was a kid, pretty mild-mannered, wearing like Cosby sweaters, and they had a little rat tail and a flat top and everything. But then one day, I'm in eighth grade, this fight broke out on the bleachers, and this vicious fight between these two boys. And I looked at one of them, and it was Ronald, and he had this, and I say this understanding like the sort of implications and that people take away from it, but I mean, he had this feral look in his eyes, and he was almost unrecognizable. And I'd seen there was another kid named Jaron, I think Jaron or Gerald, that I remembered from second grade, who, I remember I trying to help him with his handwriting, and he wasn't a bad kid. But then I bumped into him at, I think it was a junior prom or some kind of dance or something. And he just looked at me with so much ferocity in his eyes when I bumped into him at this dance. We're both wearing suits or whatever. And like he wanted to take my head off.
Why?
And I just, because I bumped into him. And it was just so shocking to see what it sort of, I don't know what happened to these boys, but they transformed somehow. So there was something that happened that I sort of was able to skip over by being taken out of that environment for that 4 years, where when I came back, I was very much just not of that world. And wow. I think looking back on it, I said to myself, what is happening to these black boys in these communities and in America, in this country.
And also other kids that perceive black boys too, it sounds like.
Yeah, it was just very bizarre to me. But the irony is I never really, race was never really a thing for me until I became an actor. And then, I went to NYU. They have a wonderful master's program for actors at NYU there. And that was when it was a 3-year program. And that was when I had this sort of huge identity crisis. And really it kind of divided into 3 separate years. So the first year, I was so hyper self-conscious and hyper self-aware, where, I was the one, it was a class of 18, and there were only 3 of us that were black. It was myself and then 2 black women, or 1 black woman and then 1 mixed biracial woman. And, and somewhere along the way, I had ingested the sort of default, I guess you would say, left-wing sort of narrative about blackness and racism and all these other things. So I think my first year there, I was very guarded and very kind of protective of my image as a black person. And the irony there is that if you can't work that way as an actor, you need to be able to, you can't be thinking about how you're being perceived by the audience, because you need to be able to free yourself to make all kinds of choices. And if everything that you do is about, how will I spent so much time my first year saying, well, how will the black students perceive me? And how will the white students perceive me? That I really stifled my own talent. I'm a big fan of rap. I still have some skill in it. And when I,
do some on the show, by the way.
Say what?
You're welcome to do some on the show if you want to.
That's all right. Thank you for the offer, though. But even in our singing class, everyone had to take singing class, and I would stay away from sort of R&B kind of songs because I didn't want to be the stereotypical black guy who raps and sings R&B. You know what I mean? It was that kind of stuff. And, you know, and I would be so self-conscious about how I was being perceived by my classmates and by, you know, and it really kind of damaged my ability to connect with my classmates. You know, really it was more of a company that they select people. You know, you spend a lot of time with these people in these programs. It's very rigorous, very vulnerable, very intimate. You can't really hide. And, you know, I got really sort of chastised often for being kind of distant and withdrawn. But my protective barrier was, well, I'm a black man. They don't understand me and what I'm going through. But I didn't understand what I was going. I mean, I was 23. I didn't know what I was going through. And I was still finding myself. But I always sort of used this excuse of my blackness to kind of, you know, fall back on this thing. And, you know, then my second year, it was funny because between my first and second year, I found out that I was going to be cast in one of the third year shows, a great play called Gem of the Ocean by the black playwright August Wilson. And I was the only second year student, you know, doing one of these shows. And, you know, August Wilson, very, very fierce, unapologetically black writer, as they would say, but fiercely wonderful playwright. And so in preparation, you know, I was playing a former slave. And so I'm reading these slave narratives. I think around that time I'd also read like Malcolm X's autobiography and some other things. And I was so blackety black that I went from like sort of being ashamed of, I guess ashamed is the right word, of my blackness, to being like, I'm full on like, man, I'm tired of white people, you know? So I went full on the other direction, and everything was about, you know, black this and black that.
The pendulum swung.
Yeah, man. But then what happened between my second and third year, and this is I think this put me on the trajectory to where I am right now, is I was privileged to be invited to work at a place called Williamstown, which is a very prestigious summer theater festival, or at least it was. I don't know if it still is, but, you know, the stars go there for the summer, and, you know, it's a short gig, it's summertime. You're at Williams College in the Berkshires. It's very nice, very, very much an honor to be invited there. And there was a point where I'll try to truncate this story, but it was a very heavily racial summer for me, where, you know, we had these 24 young actors who weren't in the union. They call it non-equity actors. Actors Equity Association is the stage actors union. Yeah. So we had the 24 non-ex, and again, it was like me and two other black guys who were the three sort of minorities there among this group of 24 actors. And it was already kind of frustrating because myself and this guy named Jordan were cast in the sort of one of the big musicals, main stage musicals, but we were sort of in the background as ensemble members. Then the other guy named Rama, you know, one of these guys who, when he stepped onto the stage, just, you immediately liked him. Just this wonderful presence, the stage presence, portly kind of guy, really just sort of an everyman kind of a guy. And he had the biggest speaking part of all of the three of us, but he was playing a butler in this Allison Janney play called The Corn is Green or something like that. I forgot what the name of the play was, or The Autumn Garden, something like that. Lillian Helmsley play, whatever. So I was already kind of like, okay, so we got the two black guys playing, you know, back up in the ensemble, and this other black guy is playing a butler. Meanwhile, my white classmates who had also been there, and my other white non-equity actor friends were cast in these sort of nice featured roles, and, you know, working with these big time directors, and, you know, and working with stars and networking and everything. And I was like, that's really interesting. And so then the first day that we were there, they had these auditions so they had these four younger directors who were assistant directors who were each directing two one-act plays over the course of the summer there. And for the first round of auditions, we all 24 of us got into this big room, and the four directors were in the back, and they were all white. And I remember at that time, I said, pause, let me turn off my cynicism and just do my thing. I did my monologue. And, you know, people who weren't even in the room that day were like, man, we heard about your piece, man. We're so glad you're here, and yada, yada, yada. And so the callback sheets went up the next day. And I wasn't called back for any of the plays.
Oh, no.
And and it wouldn't have been as bad, but neither myself nor Jordan nor Ramah were called back for any of it. And then there's like one guy from Juilliard named Jeff who was kind of weird, and it was weird, but but it was like, really? None of us were right for any of these roles. Like one of the roles was this homosexual character, and Jordan was an out gay man, and the role was what then ended up being cast with a straight white male who's one of my castmates, one of my classmates, and it's like it's not like myself and Jordan and Ramah are similar in any way. Right. It's not as though we have any similarities. And of course, once word got out that none of the black student or the black actors were called back for anything, the director's like, oh my God, we're so embarrassed. And the other actors are like, oh, that's so effed up, man. It's so effed up. And I learned, a lesson that I would learn again much later on, which we can get into, is that a lot of people just don't say anything. And I was like, this is messed up.
That was the reason? Do you feel in your heart of hearts that was the reason these directors did not choose you?
You know what? No, that's the weird thing. I was never somebody, look, I actually got racially profiled when I was 19 years old in Atlanta, Georgia. It's my first time there. And, and it was, I was coming out of some store, and it was humiliating, and the officers who were white, they could have been more polite and professional. But, it was like one of those things where, you fit the description, this, that, and the third. But you know what my first thought was? My first thought wasn't F the police. My first thought was F the guy who decided to rob some store while wearing a white T-shirt and jeans, because that's what I was wearing. So I fit the description, So my mind wasn't really, even though I'd sort of had the Kool-Aid that we all get, as black people.
The Kool-Aid we all get. Wow.
I still hadn't gone that far. But so when these four directors, when I didn't get called back, I was angry and I spoke up about it. But I never, attributed it to malice. I just said, well, they have this idea in their mind about what they think they want in these roles, and they come up from certain backgrounds and cultures, and
wow. So wait, that's very interesting. So are you able to identify that nuance that it wasn't necessarily racism, but it was more, I don't know, some might call it racialism, but that they just sort of gravitated to people that they felt more comfortable with?
I just think that I think I interpreted it that their scope was narrow.
Interesting. Interesting.
And, and so again, like my classmate, a guy named Carrie, who's this tall, blonde hair, blue eyed, good looking guy who was cast who all the ladies liked, and he liked the ladies. But of course he was cast as this gay character, I just don't know if,
yeah.
I don't know. Like I'm unwilling to attribute malice to these people.
Yeah. Well, no, that's a very sophisticated. I've shared this before with the audience. So my parents grew up in Jamaica, West Indies. So that's my cultural heritage. And my father always used to say when he was in Jamaica, he was a man. He was a man. It wasn't until he came to the United States where he realized he was a black man. That's what people told him, and that had meaning, and it created a box around what you're supposed to think, because you're no longer just a man, you're this black man. And he often stressed to his two sons that don't accept that. Don't accept that. So don't go through life thinking that everything that happens to you because you're a black man. And that's not an easy nuance to capture.
Well, here's the thing, because that very thing is kind of what changed my life in a way, because I was very angry, and I was having conversations with, even the artistic directors, a guy named Stephen Reese, I believe his name was, just wonderful actor. Like you would know if you looked him up. But it was a very angry time for me. But so I got to tell the second part before I get to what you just said.
Yeah.
So then the second round of one act plays came up, right? And guess who was at the top of all these callback lists? And at that point I was like, well, it's tainted. Now it's tainted.
Exactly.
Because am I here because you think I'm the best person for this role, or am I here to make yourselves feel better?
Oh,
And and at a certain point, I just said, you know what, man. And this is, this is to say nothing of the sort of conversations I was having with other people and just other racial dynamics that were going on, which I found very aggravating at the time. Basically, feeling overlooked and kind of disrespected in many ways. So again, it was sort of like a pull. But at a certain point, I just said to myself, you know what? I am tired of using my race as a crutch for everything that happens in my life. It was what, summer of 2007, 2008. That was a major turning point for me, where I said, you know what? Because I said, if whether you're talking about some right-wing Nazi or some left-wing progressive, there's a kind of horseshoe theory going on there, in my opinion.
there you go.
If you can't see me as a man, as a human being, before you see me as a demographic, then that's a you problem, not a me problem.
Wow.
That whole thing turned, that was like that 1 degree shift, which I think kind of set me on this whole trajectory. So in terms of my relationship with race, like it's a difference between later on, I was able to, I had the privilege of playing Caliban in Shakespeare's The Tempest in Washington, D.C. And, Caliban, of course, is a slave. He is explicitly referred to as a slave multiple times in the play. He's abused. He's treated awfully. And my costume, literally had chains on it. And I knew right away, I was in the rehearsal room saying, throw me around, abuse me. Let's go there. If we're going to go there, let's go there. And because I already knew that people were going to have, because I was around, the time where the Michael Brown stuff was sort of popping off and happening. And, I said, people are going to bring their own baggage to the show anyway. Right. And I loved my castmates, my white castmates, because they didn't apologize for anything that was happening on the stage. And again, going back to not being, as an actor, captured by this idea of how am I being perceived, it freed me up to play that role and really humanize that role. And it was a very successful production and performance. And, but if I'd been stuck in this realm of thinking where I was like, man, I'm here playing a slave, man, and I got to make sure that this character, is never shown as weak and yada yada. I'm like, no, the character of Caliban is so endearing and so dignified because of his weakness and vulnerability, and the fact that, and people might say, oh, magical Negro, whatever, but he really has a level of soul and spirit and sophistication that the other characters lack, and that's why that's what makes him so such a moving character, one of the most popular characters in the Shakespearean canon.
So what makes you think you were able to do that? Because for some people, the experiences you just had, it can reinforce their perception that everything is about race, right? And yet it seems like you had the ability to kind of pull these things apart to make you stronger.
I was just tired, and I think also, I was lucky that, neither my mother nor my grandmother, my grandmother especially, may she rest in peace, Oma, my grandmother was born in 1936, and she was a homeowner by 1969 in California. And there was not one point, and if anyone, could have complained, it could have been her, and she would never pull any punches. But she never once said anything to me about white people or about men, and neither did my mother. And so, there was never this narrative in my household growing up about, that the white man is out to get you. But I still sort of ingested that, and it took actually a relationship of mine with an Asian woman that, she was able to say, Clifton, not everyone is out to get you. I mean, that's how deep the brainwashing is, because even after I'd made that decision, it wasn't until maybe 6 or 7 years later when this woman said, people aren't really out to get you, where I was able to kind of say, huh. Wow. And then after that, everything kind of released, and my work got better, my relationships improved. And the irony is that I know that if there were, black leftists, let's say, or liberationists who were watching this, they would say, well, now you make them feel safe. See, they don't see you as dangerous no more. See, now you're an exception.
Right. Your moment of liberation is perceived as now a moment of weakness, of subjugation.
Correct. It's liberation. That's the thing. That's the irony of it to me, is that I feel so free now. I feel like this weight is lifted off my shoulder. And the irony is, I don't care what white people think about me. I don't care what anyone thinks about me from that perspective. But the irony is that I see these sort of black liberationists or progressives, whatever you want to call them, they live their lives obsessed
I
with what
know.
white people think about
I
them and
know.
receiving white validation. And I'm like, guys, no, man, like that's, to me, that is a form of white supremacy. You are sitting there.
Self-imposed.
It's
Self-imposed.
self-imposed white supremacy, and
Yes.
I can't live like that. It's like living on my knees. That's the new slavery. It's not shackles and chains. It's a mindset.
Oh, it's the
And
worst kind. It's internalized subjugation, right?
yeah, which
I
they would
can't.
accuse either of us of, ironically.
Well, as you say, that's about you, not me, right? I
Yeah.
mean, I can't tell you the number of people we've had on our show who say some variation of what you just said, which is that someone in their family, someone that they're close to, an older black person who says, "Get over it." You know what I mean? The life that we lived, versus what you were experiencing today. No one's out to get you. I can tell you when there was a time when there were people out to get you for real.
Yeah.
And of course, you've got to say the obvious caveats. It doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist or that there aren't still barriers in some way, but to the degree that for some people it is obsessive, that any challenge, any failure, every setback is driven by racial discrimination. It's almost as if losing or gaining that nuance, that ability you just talked about, would undermine anything they've ever believed, and it would be a repudiation of their entire lives. So therefore, they can't give it up.
Well, not only their entire lives, but their friend system, their social circle, maybe even family members, because you and I both know very well there's a huge social cost of sort of breaking out of this mindset where people say, I think it's so interesting now, right, that when I was younger and we were in a sort of a poor, sort of working class neighborhood, it was the poor kids that would say, well, you're trying to act white. And now I see these bourgeois blacks, I call them bourgeois blacks,
Right.
who are saying now you're enacting whiteness. So from both ends of the socioeconomic spectrum now, there's this vice grip on the black mind, which says if you act a certain way, anything you do to try to improve your life, you're trying to be a white person. And, and you face that in many aspects of your life. And so there's this weird social pressure for you to stay in this mental box. And it's so toxic, in my opinion.
Yeah, there's this guy, great creative genius. His name is Albert Eisenberg. I'm giving him a shout out. He just sent me an ad campaign where he wants to push this idea of wanting to be black, and it's basically images of black kids reading. It's like they're acting black and they're reading or they're doing their math. I actually think it's pretty creative. But yeah, we got to kill this narrative. So okay, all right. So you have you have this very interesting background, and I want to talk to you about your experience in Hollywood entertainment, some of the pushback you've gotten. But I can't not. I want to jump to the Thomas Sowell piece because you're talking about black minds and how suddenly somehow you're trying to be something else because you're smart or you're determined or you want to be accomplished. Another reason I've connected with you is that you are intending to stage a one-man show of a particular individual, Thomas Sowell, Dr. Thomas Sowell. So for most of our audience knows who this amazing person is, but why don't you tell us who is Thomas Sowell and why is it that you are inspired to do a play about his life?
Right. Well, Thomas Sowell is a revered economist and scholar and some would say philosopher who was born in June of 1930, in the dark days of Jim Crow. And he was a high school dropout. He was an orphan. He is a military veteran, a former Marine, who managed to work his way into the upper echelons of academia and in the Ivy Leagues. He graduated summa cum laude from, was it magna cum laude? I think it was magna cum laude from Harvard University. Again, this is a high school dropout. And then he went on to study at Columbia University because he was chasing Nobel Prize-winning economist George Stigler, but Stigler had just left to the University of Chicago, so he went to the University of Chicago studied there, and was and even there he impressed the likes of people like Milton Friedman and George Stigler and others. And he really distinguished himself very early on as a very bright mind. He was being published in journals, economic journals, in his early 30s. Even Milton Friedman once said that he's a genius, essentially. And even though his work initially was mainly about economics, that was his whole sort of realm of study was the history of economic ideas. He migrated outside of that realm and began to speak on issues of race, of culture, history, and he's developed over the last, since the 60s. His math is better than mine. He's really built up this massive and prolific body of work on a variety of issues. And I call him the people's intellectual. And, he has a huge body of work where he's slamming intellectuals.
Yes.
But he's one of those people that, you read his work and he talks about how he discovered when he was about 9 or 10, this teacher instilled in him this idea of scientific and systematic thinking. And so there's a logical rigor to all of his work and his thinking. And he's brilliant because he doesn't dress up any of what he says with, fancy jargon and lingo. And I first discovered his work, I was just sort of trolling through YouTube one night, and there was this classic clip of him on the Bill Buckley show in the 70s, I believe. And he is I was like, first of all, who is this like strikingly handsome black man with the perfect afro, just perfectly shaped afro and glasses, in this ill-fitting gray suit. And, he's just clinically, surgically taking apart all of these sort of received opinions that we all sort of inherit just by dint of being alive and being American, from the wage gap to racial gaps in achievement, right, and the underlying causes beneath them. And I said, who is this guy? I mean, I remember at the time I sent that clip to one of my progressive friends, and and I called him one of the few smart progressives left, and he said, yeah, I found these arguments.
Salvageable. He's still salvageable. This one.
He's a very, very smart man, and he was like, yeah, I find his arguments very compelling. And so then afterward, I think I picked up basic economics, and yes. But I think the first book of his that I dove into was Black Rednecks and White Liberals.
These are all classics,
right? And
economics we have as part of our curriculum at Vertex, our high
perfect.
School students.
I think it should be required reading for all high school students.
Yep.
And those two books right there completely changed the way that I see life and the way that I approach it and the way that I see the world.
Wow.
And so years later.
No, just for a second. So, educator, what did you? At a high level, what did you read in those two books that completely transformed the way you see the world?
Well, it's two things mainly. One, as far as Black Rednecks and White Liberals, was this idea that, cracker culture, redneck culture, coming from the south of Britain, this idea that these Europeans were coming and the same kinds of things that we say about, say, ghetto blacks, let's just say it, were the same kind of complaints that Europeans and Northerners were making about these redneck whites. Right. And so that really highlighted for me the importance of culture, because then you hear about freed blacks or blacks in the North who didn't have these kinds of problems. And it really gave an entirely new kind of color to, so to speak, to like the Great Migration North and, why Jim Crow laws came into being. But mainly it was about, culture versus race. The second big thing for economics was just looking at how things work, markets and prices, and people exchanging goods and services with each other, and how there's sort of, I guess it's the Adam Smith invisible hand at work. And it really it's a beautiful thing when you think about it, this sort of web of interconnecting people, making these people who don't know each other, making all these individual transactions, and that's sort of how the system works. But by chapter 2, I was like, I'm never ever voting for a socialist ever in my life, because like how can it work? How could it possibly work?
Wow.
So it really blew my mind open on two levels in terms of culture and society. and how they function, how they feed each other. And at that point, once you begin to see it, you can't really unsee these kinds of things, and you begin to spot the logical fallacies. And again, if you're in entertainment, you hear this stuff all the time in rehearsal rooms and in audition rooms, and when you're on set or backstage talking to other actors and other entertainment professionals who just say stuff.
Yeah.
They just say stuff, and they think that it's true. And you're like, well, no, there's
right, without evidence, right?
Well, no, but not only that, but it's just there's no consideration that there's another way to think about things. And I think another reason that Sowell appealed to me so much was because I encountered him at a time where my own mind was changing about certain things. And I know that part of his story is very famous, is that he was a radical Marxist. And, as a matter of fact, Milton Friedman said that he's too smart. He's a socialist, but he's too smart to remain one for very long. And, I sort of gotten quote unquote red pilled in 2014. And the fact that there was someone else that, looked like me, if you want to go that route, who had these sort of similar ideology, but was able to change his mind, was very, very appealing to me, personally. And so anyway, years later, I guess we fast forward to last year, and I had this sort of idea cooking in my brain for a long time, because there's a wonderful actor in New York named John Douglas Thompson who did this play called Satchmo at the Waldorf, by Terry Teachout of the late Terry Teachout of Wall Street Journal. But it was a one-person show about Louis Armstrong. And then about 2014, the great Lawrence Fishburne did a show called Thurgood, which is a one-man show about Thurgood Marshall.
Sure.
And then way back in the 70s, there was a play called Robeson, which James Earl Jones did about the great Paul Robeson. And so I just began to think to myself, and I'd sort of had this idea in the back of my head for a while, but I was like, well, what if, there was a one-person show about Tom Sowell? Like, that would kind of be interesting, wouldn't it? And it was funny because everyone that I spoke to about the idea was like, oh man, you have to do that. You have to do that. And finally, in February of 2024, with the help of a man named Tom Woods, he sort of helped push me to make this thing happen. I launched an Indiegogo campaign, and the initial plan was like, let me just, I'll ask for like $10,000, and so I can just take like 6 months to do research and get a first draft of this thing, and then we'll see where it goes. And it's funny because Tom was like, well, I did the same thing. We have to have you on my podcast and talk about it. And he said, I did the same thing for my buddy who wanted to write a book. And he was able to raise $40,000. I can't guarantee you'll get that much money, but we'll see what happens. And so ultimately, I went on the show and I announced that I was doing this thing. And we ended up raising over $140,000 for this crowdfunding campaign.
Wow. Probably a lot of small donations too, right?
It was small donations and large donations, mm-hmm. And I learned a lot about sales and and these kinds of things. It turns out, and maybe my friends in entertainment can learn this, but if you create things that people want to see, people are willing to invest money into it.
Yeah, even before, to bring it into reality, absolutely.
Yeah, so it's very exciting. I think it was, and it's funny because
I've offered you opening night at Vertex Partnership Academies in the Bronx.
I know, man.
You could have a huge group of young people, primarily Black and Hispanic students from low-income communities, who will have already read Thomas Sowell and would be a small snippet of the kinds of young people that would need to see that play. We all watched the Super Bowl, last week, and we see, Kendrick Lamar, and some consider it an amazing performance. But if I would compare, 20 minutes watching that versus an hour of watching you perform Thomas Sowell, I'll choose that 100 times, particularly for our students.
Well, that's very flattering. The thing about it is that the challenge there is because you called me a playwright at the beginning of our conversation, and I'm not a playwright. I'm an actor, so I'm treating it right now as a character study. In that, I mean, my plan, and I'm far behind because I've been so distracted by so many things, trying to do everything at once. So this year is about
Get
hunkering
it done.
down and
Get it
getting it
done.
done. Yeah,
Get it
and getting
done.
it done because it's so important. You know what I mean? And it's such a privilege, and a great responsibility. And I'm saying no to so many things. Like I've stopped even doing
Yes.
podcasts. You know what I mean? And so this is,
Well, thank you for doing this one.
yeah. I was like, yes, I will. This is important, so I'll do this one.
I took a
Because
class at the new school years ago, and I finished. It was called "Get the Damn Thing Done," and it was a screenwriting class, and I finished my screenplay.
fantastic.
Yeah, you just gotta buckle down. We all want it, man. So as soon as you get it done, seriously, there's a huge audience waiting for this.
Yeah, well, I'm excited. I know it's going to be great. I just have to pour through his massive body of work because the track right now, and I'll share this with my backers as well. But it's just the foundation, right, is learning. When I approach a character, I start out with an overall point of view, and how can I explain this? Where, like with Caliban, I said, this person he's an abandoned child, and then I built out my performance from that kind of concept. When
Right.
I played Macduff in Macbeth, he's the hero in the play Macbeth. It was as simple as everything that Macbeth is, Macduff isn't. Macduff is a man of God. Macduff is patriotic. Macduff is married with children. There's a big line in the play where he says, Macbeth has no children, and it was that kind of simple realization where I said, I'll build out my performance from there. And so with Sowell, it's hunting down at first that kernel of what's my point of view about him, because I think the public face about him is like, he's this fierce intellectual and these kind. But it's like, that's sort of going to be boring to watch on stage, in terms of, if it's a big intellectual exercise, it's going to be boring for an hour. So you need to find out what's underneath his skin. And what's great is that one, he's very, very funny. And I have a very dry sense of humor, and so does Thomas Sowell, so it works for me. But he's a when I read his writing, I see a toughness, a grit, and a ferocity, a rage inside of him, and a hunger for the truth that I think is very, very compelling and very exciting to kind of dig into. What's the source of that anger and rage? And what's underneath that? What are the tragedies in his life? What is he afraid of? What makes him sad and depressed in these kinds of things? And digging into what that is. So I have an idea for, it might be a two-acter. What the first act is, I think I know what it is. The second act, from a performer and audience perspective, is probably going to be a time jump ahead. So he's a little bit older and a bit more grizzled. So it's fun. But anyway, the first part is just getting that biographical base and like, who is this person, and what's my point of view about that person? What's going to be that through line through the story, through the play, and then it's absorbing his intellectual work and his ideas,
Yeah.
and synthesizing those into his voice and figuring out like, how do I shape this into something that's really compelling to watch and fun to watch. So it's a challenge, but I'm also, it's like, I'm not complaining because it's like the best homework assignment I've ever gotten.
Well, yeah, exactly. And also think about Thomas Sowell, the sequel, because there's so many periods in his life. One, just for what it's worth, in I think it was 1980, he has already been seeing sort of the trends. I mean, a lot of his research is on like the significant growth of the black middle class and upper class, and that he started to see these downward declines. And in 1980, of course, going against the grain, he said maybe some of these social welfare policies aren't actually having the intended, impact. Even though the words might sound nice in terms of purpose, the results aren't so great. So he got a group of incredible economists together, including Milton Friedman, at the Fairmont Hotel,
Right.
and held the Fairmont Conference, and he called it the empower. empowering alternatives conference. Like basically, you want to get a group of people together to say, look, we don't have all the right ideas, but what's happening now is hurting the Black community, and let's come together with evidence to look at empowering alternatives. And that conference is legendary because there were just people there willing to have a discussion, an evidence-based discussion about different ways to approach how you uplift not only the Black community, but all people. And so 40 years later, myself, Glenn Lowry, Shelby Steele, Jason Riley held a conference to replicate what happened back in 1980, inspired by Thomas Sowell. And now we're about to do it again in May of 2025. We're going to have the third conference. But if you can capture this nuance, that he's just this man who's just willing to follow the evidence where it leads and be willing to take a whole lot of criticism simply because he has the courage to think differently.
Well, I think, well, first off, I'm going to put you on the spot and ask for an invitation to that conference. I'd love to come.
You're in.
Well, fantastic. I think what I'm thinking right now is that the first part of the play has to take place in the 1960s. It has to, because that decade, just dramatically speaking, is so fraught with tension and conflict. And there was so much that was happening in his personal life, in his professional life, in his ideological life, his academic life, and in society as a whole. So it's just pregnant with possibility there. But then I look at the 1980s, as you explained, and so much of his most important work, like Knowledge and Decisions, for instance, was published right at the top of that decade.
Right.
Came out during that decade. And when you read his, especially A Man of Letters, and or should I say, maybe it was Jason Riley's book, Maverick, which is very useful in terms of its sources. And you go and look back, and the things he was saying back then, and the vicious attacks that he received from the Black intelligentsia, the NAACP, Democrat operatives, these kinds of things. I mean, it's a carbon copy of what you see today.
Yes.
And so, in some ways, I think of his life. To me, there's kind of a tragic element in a way. Who's someone who has this great vision, this great mind, who's done so much work in trying to get these ideas out there for the public. And I think he's been successful in terms of, like the man on the street can read basic economics and understand it, which is why he wrote it as simply as he did. But as you said, he's been talking about this stuff for decades, and it hasn't really improved. I'd say it's only gotten worse. So how must what must that feel like to know? I mean, the flip side is that I think he's sort of he's experiencing a resurgence in popularity, which is really interesting. I'm seeing a lot of more.
We're trying. I mean, many of us. This Presidential Medal of Freedom, if it is actually awarded to him, I think for tens of thousands of people across the country, it will be a culmination of years of effort to try and get his work recognized for the impact that it has already had, but really only scratches the surface of if we really took into account in terms of public policy, cultural attitudes and shifts, if we really understood his research and what he was able to show what contributes to human flourishing. I mean, it would be transformative for our society.
It's that, and I mean, I love A Conflict of Visions. I mean, that book, if anyone wants to understand why the pandemic years turned out the way they did, that book is like a primer on it. So it's not just that, it's the way he's been able to frame our differing ideologies and the work of Knowledge and Decisions of just breaking down, what is knowledge and how it's accumulated and how it's distributed throughout society and how it influences how we live. I mean, it's just these, and being able to translate it so that dummies like me can read it and say, "Oh, this is interesting." You know,
Right.
I thought to myself, even if he never wins a Nobel Prize, or even if he never gets a, you know, that Medal of Freedom, I think his major contribution, and maybe he senses this as well, is that he's been able to take these big, weighty, complex ideas and distill them down so that anyone can grasp them and understand them. That's why I call him the people's intellectual. He really is. I mean, that kind of that whole Chicago school gang, in a way, of economists, from Stigler to Friedman, I find really interesting because of their passion for making economics practical, taking it out
Accessible.
of the abstract and putting it into like more concrete terms, and how does it apply to everyday life, which is
Well, the reason
valuable.
I one among the many reasons I'm excited about what you're doing is that in the form of theater, it's just another way to make his work and his life accessible and known to, I'm really hoping, millions more people, because it's a voice that's been suppressed, unfortunately, for far too long.
Well, you know, now is the perfect time. I mean, I've been sort of banging this drum for a long time about how, uh, you know, pop culture really right now is up for grabs. It's kind of outside the scope of this podcast, but you
No,
know, I
it's
mean,
not.
I mean, the monopoly over information, ideas, conversation, and culture has been broken. And you know, new media, all this technology, the way we're able to share back and forth and communicate and get these ideas out there now is totally changed. And it's funny because you see, you know, I call it, you know, the bourgeoisie are melting down and they're apoplectic. They have no idea what to do. And it's just so funny to me to watch them say things like, you know, we need our own Joe Rogan. It's like, well, you know, you had Joe Rogan, but you're completely inauthentic and you're in an echo chamber, and everyone can see you're lying but you. And you know, and now I think it's
Yeah,
the ripe time.
yeah, and for what it's worth, Joe Rogan doesn't belong to anyone, right? Joe Rogan just he talks and he has guests on who express views, and if those views make sense, those ideas percolate. If they don't make sense, then people ultimately come to their senses.
Yeah, you know, I mean, he's just a guy. He's the first person to say it. Like he's like, I'm a comedian who smokes weed and, you know, it commentates on fights. I like talking to people and I'm curious, and you know, I'll talk to anyone, and that's his ethos. That's why people like him. That's why he's so relatable. But it's funny you say he doesn't belong to anyone, because I feel the exact same way about Thomas Sowell. He doesn't really belong to anyone. That's one of the through lines, I think, in his life, which is that he is his own man. The idea that you know, he was a Marxist when he went into the Chicago school, and was still one when he came out. And he, you know, he was going toe to toe with Stigler on ideas, and he never backed down. He was never one to back away from a challenge or from an intellectual challenge, and he always kind of stuck to his own guns until he was forced to change by evidence. And you know, I love this sort of idea that he's just this fiercely independent man who says, you know, I have my own mind, and that to me is such a fierce, sort of at the core of who he is. And how do you embody that? How do you dramatize that? You know, how do you make that a theme in his story is really interesting to me. But you know, that's why he's so powerful, is that he doesn't really belong to anyone.
Yep. This is why I run schools. I want to cultivate young people who develop that same ability to have informed, evidence-based opinions, and have the ability to think for themselves. Think for themselves. Wow. Well, Mr. Clifton Duncan, I really actually feel that we could go on for a little while longer.
Yeah, yeah. I talk a
But
lot.
no, 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 it's great. But I do want to ask you a closing question, which is, you know, which is all of our listeners know, you know, my colleague Nike and I, you know, when we crafted The Invisible Man, it was this idea of speaking to a young man, Daryl, a 16-year-old black kid who hears the narrative that often is the one that's trying to suppress someone like a Thomas Sowell, but it's a narrative that says the country is rigged against you, your skin color is a huge liability, um, and that you know you're second class in some way. And I'd love to ask you what you would counsel. How would you counsel a kid like that, living in forgotten USA, black kid hearing this narrative?
Um, I was laughing because thinking one of the things my grandmother said, don't bring home no babies.
Well, that's a good place to start. That is a good place to start.
It was wonderful advice, which I followed. I guess the first thing that jumps to mind is what my lovely ex-girlfriend told me, which is that everyone's not out to get you. The world is not out to get you. And I'd follow that up with you are valuable. It sounds kind of maybe treacly and cliche, but that mind shift of, I guess, the dual mind shift of, society, everyone is not out to get you, and and never allow anyone to allow you to use your race as a crutch. Never use your race as a crutch for the things that happen in your life. That was the big moment for me that helped me sort of break out of that prison. And once you make that decision, and I know it's sort of people eye roll, it's like, oh, the whole personal responsibility talking point. But if you can look beyond that and say, no, this is what Black liberation really is. It's breaking out of that mindset, breaking out of that mental prison, where you're able to say, you know what, if someone else can't see me as anything but Black, as opposed to seeing me as a human being, that has nothing to do with me. That has everything to do with you. I'm a man. I am, I feel, I laugh, I cry, I'm afraid of things. I can be vulnerable. I can be intelligent. I have skills. I have talents. I have abilities. I'm a very unique person. And, life is here to live. And you have to go out and live it and not live it in fear, which is what everyone wants you to do, in fear and in anger and in resentment. You can't do that. You can't do that. It's so unhealthy. It's so toxic. It's so cancerous and poisonous. And it's going to destroy your life if you allow it to eat you up from the inside.
Wow. All right. My gosh. Okay, Mr. Clifton Duncan. So I think I'll get to see you in May at our old Parkland conference, inspired by the great Thomas Sowell. Thank you for everything that you have done. You're doing, the way that you think, maybe more than anything, because the way that you think, you're able to distinguish what the world might be signaling, but what you know inside is the truth that you choose to pursue. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for being a guest on the Invisible Men.
The pleasure is all mine, Ian. Thank you.
Yes. All right, to our listeners, if you want to see any other episodes of The Invisible Men, you can go to www.invisible.men, or you can go to wherever podcasts are shown and listened to. But once again, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time on The Invisible Men.